Hey guys, we're
All right.
live, and we're going to be talking about syscalls. Got Rob here. We're going to wait a few minutes for a few more people to join. I don't know why our concurrence dropped by like 40 viewers down to 10. I'm not sure what I did to offend everyone, but we're just going to give it a minute for more people to join the stream. Probably start in about, let's say, in about a minute or so. But today we're going to be talking about syscalls, and we're going to be talking about how they're used to evade our sort of standard hints for how to unpack malware and use a debugger to debug malware. So stay tuned for that and tell your friends to join so that we have enough viewers to get started. Also, if you hear noises in the background, it's my dog. He's going crazy. It's rainy out, so he didn't get a full walk today, so he's really mad. Hello from Vietnam. Again, hello from Vietnam. I think I saw guided hacking in the chat, getting up early to learn about syscalls. Almost certain guided hacking knows everything there is to know about syscalls. Not sure, not sure what's new in this stream. Could have slept in. Um, all right. What do you think, Rob? You think we should get started?
Ready when you are.
All right. Okay. All right. Officially starting. Hopefully everything is good. You guys can hear us and you can see the screen okay. Let me know in the chat if anything's messed up and we'll try and fix it. Obviously, I don't know what you guys see, so hopefully everything looks good. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about syscalls, which is the, well, actually I won't spoil it for you. If you guys know what it is, you know what it is. If you don't, you have to stick around for the stream. And we have Rob here, RedTeam-Rob. who you guys might recognize from our other stream where he took us through the leaked Conti ransomware playbook and gave his opinion on that. So we wanted to have him back because he's actually a developer on Posh C2. Is it Posh C2 or just Posh?
Poshy too.
Posh
Yeah.
C2, yeah. So he's basically
Yes.
building red team tools, and we want to share this trick that he's using to evade some detection. And I thought it'd be cool because a lot of the stuff that a lot of our tutorials and stuff rely on breakpoints on Windows APIs. And this kind of like negates all of that. It kind of flies by those. So I thought it'd be cool to, introduce this concept to you guys for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about and have him kind of walk through how these work and whatnot. So with that, I guess I'll give it over to you, Rob, and take it away.
Sweet. Cheers, dude. So yeah, as Sergey said, we're going to look at syscalls. This isn't really anything new in the syscall space. This is really me just aggregating a bunch of really great stuff by a bunch of really great people and kind of presenting it with both the red and the blue side. So we're going to look at how they get used, and we're also going to try and look at a few ways that you can catch them and detect them, or at least find out if your binary is using syscalls, if you're trying to reverse engineer one. So you don't fall afoul from some of the techniques that we'll be going over.
Yeah.
So to start with, as a kind of brief sanity check, just to kind of go over what kind of normal, really naughty malware looks like. We've got an example here called API example. This is going to be some malware that's going to inject just some message box shellcode using the standard APIs that a lot of us will know and love. So it's going to start with opening a handle to a target process. It's going to allocate some memory in that process. It's going to write the shellcode into that memory, and then just create a thread to run that code, and then run the shellcode. So as an example, we're going to start out Notepad here. This is going to be our victim process. Sit there and look pretty. I'm going to open a process hacker. Let's just find out what the PID is for this. It's a 5904.
So for those of you
And
who haven't
then
used Process Hacker before, which I think is, probably everybody's used it, but basically it's like Process Explorer on steroids. It's like you have a lot more options to investigate or interrogate running processes, do things like look at the memory sections and stuff like that. It's super powerful. So sorry to interrupt, Rob, but I think like some people may not be familiar with it. So, and I think it's a great tool for this sort of, live dynamic analysis.
for sure, yeah, process hacker is great. We're going to be using it just a little bit today, kind of get a sense of what's going on, but it's definitely one to add to the toolkit. So yeah, we're going to run our API example. We're going to pass it the PID of our process, give it a run, and we can see that it opens the process okay. It's allocating some memory, writing the memory, changing it to read execute, and creating a thread. And then you can ignore that because that's just not true. And we can see we get a little pop-up saying demonstrating that the shellcode's been run. So that's all good.
So that shellcode is running in the Notepad process, right? So like we've injected that in Notepad, and then that's what's popped up the little message box.
Exactly. So we can actually open up Notepad here, go to memory, and let's go to EBC E5 B000, EBC E5. This is always the most difficult part of the stream, trying to find the right bit of memory. Is that this one, I think? Yeah, and then we can actually see it here. This is the shellcode, and we can tell it's the shellcode because there's the Syscall's injection. Bam, said the lady. So it's doing exactly what it says in the tin. And we can confirm that if we open up in like CFF Explorer, we can look at the imports, and let's come to kernel 32, and you can see write process memory, open process, virtual protect X, virtual allocate, all the real sus imports for a little binary.
For those of you who've watched a lot of our tutorials, you'll recognize those API calls. I mean, that's basically every packer ever. You see those 4 API calls.
Yeah.
So.
We could set a few of the standard breakpoints again. So this is all kind of the usual process. What we see all the time. And then if we run it, and let's just change the command line to actually provide it with a PID. It was 5904. We can see, we hit an open process, and then it stopped for some reason. But we hit our API calls, and it's not doing anything new. But we're just going to go over that briefly so that we can contrast it with the Syscalls one. So if we actually just run the Syscalls one to begin with, it's doing exactly the same stuff. We're going to provide it with a PID. It's opened the memory, allocated the memory, wrote the shellcode, all the same stuff, and we can see we're getting our pop-up again. However, if we actually look at it with CFF Explorer, let's go to the imports. Unsurprisingly, it's not going to have any of those imports. We don't see virtual alloc, we don't see write process memory or open process, anything like that. And if we open up in x64 debug, make sure our breakpoints are set, hit play, we hit our entry point, but then nothing happens. We don't hit any of our breakpoints. And this is kind of what we wanted to highlight today. So if this happens to you, if you're looking at something and it's just it's doing something, but you're not entirely sure what, and you're not able to get to the bottom of it, you don't hit any breakpoints, and you don't see any imports, you don't see any dynamic import resolution. There's no load libraries, get proc addresses, no API hashes, none of that kind of good stuff. It might be using Syscalls.
Right.
And so that's what we're looking to cover.
Yeah, this is never fun. If you run something in a debugger, you think that you have your breakpoints set, and then it's just executing and not hitting any of the breakpoints. It's never a fun experience. And this might give you some tools. Digging into this and explaining how this works might give you some tools for places to look, try and figure out what's going on.
For sure. So I guess the first thing we need to cover is what is a Syscall, and how does this fit into the picture that we have. And to do that, we need to talk about the Windows API. So the Microsoft Windows is obviously an operating system, and it exists in essentially two modes of execution. So you have kernel mode and user land. User land is what you're normally used to. It's where all your apps run. It's where most of the stuff happens. But anything that has to interact with the operating system or the hardware or anything like that takes place in kernel mode. And kernel mode is protected. Normally, user land processes can't interact with it. You can't touch its memory. You just can't interfere with the kernel. And if there is a kernel bug, if you do manage to do that in some way and it falls apart, that's when you get that infamous blue screen of death, and the machine you just have to reboot it. It just dies. The kernel mode is protected, but you have to enter kernel mode quite regularly. Anytime you do anything to the hardware, for example, you need to read something from disk, you need to interact with the memory. That all
Anything
happens through the kernel.
in Windows. Basically,
Yeah, basically
everything
anything.
you do has to go through the kernel.
So there has to be this way of transitioning from user land to kernel mode, and that is through the use of syscalls. But we don't use syscalls ourselves. We have these layers of abstraction. So I have a kind of diagram here that where you go through the what's called the Windows Win32 API or the Windows application programming interface, and these are a bunch of APIs that that Microsoft puts forward. They're expecting you to use these. They're saying, like, if you're using Windows, this is how you interact with the operating system. And if you're using like a higher level language like C# or Python or something like that, ultimately it all goes through the Windows API, and ultimately that in and of itself routes through, comes down to syscalls. So we can see here, for example, we've got Explorer, Paint, various apps, and they will use functions like open process and write process memory or whatever API calls are needing to do. There's hundreds, and these are all documented on MSDN. So we can see an example here. Write process memory. So this is the C++ syntax and the arguments it takes. And the point is here that this is what Microsoft are expecting you to use. And the reason we have this is, like I said, there's these layers of abstraction, so that the internals of this can change. Microsoft can change the way those work without breaking all the apps, because they can change the kind of inner workings, the outer workings stay the same, and everything keeps running smoothly. But under the hood, these APIs, when they get called, sometimes they'll call other internal APIs, but eventually they'll get routed through and down to a syscall, to that gateway from user land to kernel land. And this takes place in usually in NTDLL. There's also certain kind of GUI functions that are slightly different, but almost all the real ones take place in NTDLL, and that transitions to kernel mode. So we can see that here. The HAL is the hardware extraction layer. So that's essentially the hardware interface, kind of the layers of what's going on in the operating system. So the flow of a thread or an execution, we can see that here. Create remote thread, another standard top level Windows API call, one that Microsoft is providing for you to use, and one that we're using in our API shellcode to create a thread in the target process in Notepad to actually run our shellcode. And this is a part of the 32 API. It's in user land, and it's in this header. But under the hood, it will do a bunch of stuff, and ultimately it calls an internal API called nt-create-threadx. And these are API calls in NTDLL, and this has the syscall in it. So as part of its function body, it makes the syscall. And most of these, like I said, these exist in NTDLL.dll.
It's probably worth noting actually right now that like those lower level NT calls are usually what we're trying to put breakpoints on when you find a more complex piece of malware, because they'll call those and they'll skip the higher level APIs in order to add some extra, work on the analyst part. So a lot of the time you'll have, the easiest way to look for allocated memory would be to put a breakpoint on virtual alloc, but there's also an anti-allocate virtual memory call in NTDLL, which you can put a breakpoint on as well for any malware that's calling lower level. And then, of course, the next point Rob's going to explain if they bypass all of those.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like EDRs, defensive products, breakpoints. They'll often set hook or break on this API call here, create remote thread, and then as Sergey was alluding to, if you're looking for kind of the internal ones, you'll set break or hook on nt-create-threadx or the internal ones that actually make the syscalls themselves. But ultimately, the actual interface between user land and kernel mode is this syscall. This is kind of the lowest level we can get to from user land without like a kernel exploit or a kernel driver or something that we've managed to get. So for the average Joe, this is as low as we can get, but it does mean that any kind of detections or anything that happens over here we just bypass that entirely because we're not actually using them at all. And there's a bunch of these internal functions in NTDLL. So what basically, everything that interacts with the hardware layer or with the kernel comes through these syscalls, and they all take place here. This is just one example. And as for what a syscall actually looks like, we actually see NT-create thread here. Let's zoom in a little bit. Essentially, all it is it moves a syscall number into the REX register or the EX register, and then invokes the syscall instruction. And this is 64-bit. It's slightly different for 32-bit and syscall 64, but or for WAL64. But for 64-bit, it's just moves it into racks and invokes syscall. And then what happens in the kernel is the kernel has what's called the system service dispatch table. And it looks up that number in the table, and it's a function pointer, and it just goes and executes that function. And that's how it kind of limits the interactions to like a known quantity, but allows you to map those numbers to what you need to do. So that's how syscalls work. That's all that happens. It's this flow until we get to the point where we need to transition to the kernel. We move a number into the RX and we invoke syscall.
And I think it's important to note that like the syscall numbers, the actual numbers that are used, change. They're not consistent.
Yeah.
And so that if you just call a syscall thinking like, oh well, yeah, 4E is going to be whatever API, it can change between versions of Windows. So they have to be either dynamically looked up or built for the specific version of Windows that you're executing on, which I think Rob is going to talk about in a minute.
Yeah. So like these do change, like even between like just updates to Windows 10, they change not irregularly. So you can't rely on using this number, so you have to target the specific version that the victim's using, or dynamically resolve them, which there are a couple of different ways to do that. So I guess we'll come on to actually what that looks like under the hood. Let's have a look at the source code of the syscalls example, and just kind of marry that up so we can verify what we're looking at, and then we're going to look at some detections or some ways to kind of figure out that syscalls are in use if you come across some malware like this.
I should also mention that this is Rob's blog that he's reading from, and we'll put a link in the video description below afterwards, so you guys can just follow through if you want to take a closer look at that.
Yeah, for sure. No, so the source code for all of this is on GitHub as well, which I think Sergey will presumably post a link to.
Yeah, I'll link to it.
So both the API example and the syscall example, it's all up there with the message box shellcode, so anyone can take a look at this themselves. But if you have a real quick look at the syscalls at the API example rather, it's again, this is exactly what we saw or expected to see from the looking at the imports, looking at the behavior, and looking in the debugger. We check for a PID, and then we open that PID with open process. We allocate some space in that process equal to the size of the shellcode that we're looking to eject. We write into that process the shellcode that we're looking to create. We change it to execute read so that we can actually execute it without erroring. And then we just create a thread at that allocation in the target process. So exactly the calls that we think. Now, if we actually look at the syscalls example, you'll see it actually looks really similar. And again, the behavior is really similar. It's doing the same thing. We get the PID. We call, in this case, this function here called NT-open process.
Which is not the API call.
There's a little bit. Yeah, we'll come to that. It's not the API call, the NT-open process, and there's a bit of extra kind of stuff going on here. That's because these are lower level calls, so we're emulating these lower level calls, so we don't have those layers of abstraction to make it all nice and pretty for us. But ultimately, we're just opening a handle to a process with the same access. But as Sergey said, we're not actually calling here NT-open process. This has been named the same to make life easier for the programmer, so that you kind of using the functions with the same names as the ones that you're expecting to use. But we're actually using a third-party project here on GitHub called SysWhispers2. And again, this is not a new technique. It's been around for so long that we have SysWhispers2 as well as SysWhispers1. But it's a great project. Highly recommend anyone looking at it. For anyone who's looking at this stuff, it does all the heavy lifting for what we're doing here. And essentially, you get a header file which contains all your function definitions, again named in the same way as the actual functions in NTDLL, so that you can use them in the same way to take the same arguments. It's all kind of nice and easy to use. But under the hood, it's actually we have the assembly as part of the project. So we don't call ntdll.ntallocate virtual memory. That at no point are we going into NTDLL. We have our own definition here with the syscall instruction, and this is what we're invoking. And this is slightly a little bit different to what we saw when we looked at it in IDA, because what it does is it backs up the arguments. So in Windows 10, the 64-bit calling convention, the first 4 integer arguments are passed in RCX, RDX, R8, and R9. So we just back these up and allocate some stack space. And then because we're going to call this function, passing in this identifier or this hash. And this is just a unique hash within syswhispers. So again, this code is generated by syswhispers. This is a unique hash for NT-allocate virtual memory. And then we call this function, which is get syscall number. And this is going to dynamically resolve the syscall number for this identifier, so this function, and populate that. That's the correct one for the version that this is running in. So the idea being that we don't want to hard code it, because otherwise if there's an update or if someone's not upgraded and when we thought they had, it's just going to crash. So we dynamically resolve it in this way. And this will return that syscall number in the racks register, just as is usual. And then we kind of repopulate our args and make them invoke the syscall. And these are all basically exactly the same. You can see the exact same here. The only difference is the kind of identifier or the hash in use for that function, which gets passed to this get syscall number function from syswhispers. So again, it does all the heavy lifting. Syswhispers, it puts out this assembly and this header file and this C file, so that as a developer using this stuff, we just need to call NT query information process or NT wait for multiple objects and so on, and it figures out what the right syscall is and makes the syscall into kernel mode.
So now would be a good time to stop for one sec. I see a bunch of questions in the chat again about like, why the hell are we doing this? What's the point? The point is that we're avoiding calling any API calls, right? So if we have a sandbox that's adding hooks to NTDLL, or we have ourselves as analysts, we're using x64 debug, and we're putting breakpoints on APIs to try and identify, breakpoints to see what memory is allocated or to see, if a process is created. By using syscalls directly, you avoid all of that. I mean, you can bypass the debugger breakpoints, you can bypass hooks on any DLLs, any userland sandbox. You can bypass many of the hooks in userland sandboxes. So this is an evasion technique. And the reason why we had Rob on, I just wanted to stop because I saw a lot of questions about this in the comments here in the chat. So the reason why we had Rob on is because this is used a lot in red teaming tools. I saw somebody mentioning Cobalt Strike, obviously Posh C2. Everyone has their own version of using syscalls for evasion, but it's also used by malware. Now, I'll talk after this, I'll talk a little bit about some different ways that they use it in malware, but this is just a more advanced way of calling Windows APIs without actually having to call the API, without actually having to go through the DLLs. So it's used for evasion, and that's basically why, the whole point of all this. So just want to clear that up.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the primary reason we'll use it on our red team is largely for the automatic detections. So EDRs, so there's like next gen antivirus and stuff like that. Will hook all these functions, anything that can be used maliciously, so open process, virtual alloc and so on. And then because they've hooked it, whenever that gets called, they can go and check the parameters and they can determine whether something's malicious or not. But if we're not using those APIs because we're going directly to syscalls, we're just bypassing all that. They don't see it. So what they have to do is essentially have a kernel driver that monitors the other side for the calls that are made into kernel mode. But you actually have less information in kernel mode than you do in userland.
A lot less.
You only have access to the kernel stack. So we're bypassing all the detections for userland, and we're we know that the only things that these products have is the restricted information in kernel mode.
Yeah, I should. Yeah, that's
Um,
also a really good point here because I saw somebody else saying like, oh, we'll just use, AV uses kernel drivers, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's very true. And like every EDR, every AV is going to have a kernel component for this exact reason. But you have really limited visibility in the kernel. You don't have access to a lot of the extra information that you have from user land. So almost every EDR, every AV solution, every sandbox has both a user land component and a kernel component, right? And they marry the two to get the most information. What we're doing now is we're eliminating that user land component, right? We're basically making it very difficult for the user land component to get any information out. So yes, you can still detect these from kernel. Obviously, it's you're calling into the kernel. So if you're in the kernel, you can see it. But this is still a real pain in the ass, to be honest. Like when you see stuff like this, it's hard to analyze, which we're going to show you guys in a minute. Even if you have visibility in the kernel, still a pain in the ass.
Yeah, for sure. And what we're really targeting, the target audience for this are the analysts, or people like manually reversing it. So you have a sample and you're looking to triage it.
Yeah.
This, we're not giving in. The purpose of this isn't to help out EDRs. If they use it, great.
Yeah.
Got no problem with that. But that's not the target audience. We're looking for the people if you run something and you put your breakpoints and you're looking at your imports and you've run it in a sandbox and you're just not getting information. But it's malicious. Hopefully, you can lean on these sorts of this few short techniques that we're going to come up with.
Yeah, exactly.
So just kind of moving down this sample. Sorry, you going to say something?
Oh no, I just my dog is barking like crazy in the background. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. So just moving down this example again. It looks like it works exactly the same way. So open process, allocate virtual memory, write virtual memory, protect it, but change it to execute read. And then create a thread. There's a little bit more going on because we don't have those layers of abstraction to simplify it for us, but it's all doing exactly the same stuff. And we can actually kind of marry this up to if we open up the sample, the compiled sample in IDER, we can marry this up. So if I come here, I have the example open. As you can see here, we've got this is just IDER free. And we've got the strings that are helpfully kind of let us know roughly where we are. But if you didn't have those, you'd be coming down. And it's kind of what does this look like? So we can see here, this is where we're allocating memory, right? So it's going to be this call here. And we know that because
we have the source code.
Because we have the source code, which is helpful. I could definitely recommend analyzing malware if you have the source code. That's much easier. But we can see that this looks very familiar, right? We have part where we move the stuff on the stack, part where we create some stack space. We have our hash, our identifier, and then we call this function. So we can hypothesize, or we know that this function is going to be the one that resolves the right syscall, and then we have our syscall instruction. And we know this looks similar because it is similar. This is assembly. This is the exact same assembly as these ones. But how do we know that if we don't have the source code? What do we do? What do we know? How do we know what to look for? One of the quickest and easiest and kind of dumbest things that we've kind of come up with is if you just have a sample, something that's much bigger than this, and you're not sure what's going on, you can actually search just for the syscall. If you search for syscalls, but with the find all occurrences checked, it'll actually show you like any instance of syscall within the kind of the IDER project. So if we run that here, we get our strings and so on. We can ignore those, but we have all the syscalls here that are in use or are in the project. Now, if you see this in a third-party tool, it's an immediate red flag. Like there is no case where something should be using syscalls as part of their own internal code. They should always use those layers, those abstraction layers of Windows API and similar, because these system call numbers can change at any point. It's just not a thing that real developers should do. So if you see it, immediate red flag, definitely know something's up. At least you're on the right track.
Yeah, definitely. I guess it's just good to repeat that one more time. So obviously, this isn't always going to be the case. A lot of time when you have in malware, you have stuff that's calling syscalls. they will hide that code by injecting it at runtime and stuff. Because if they have it in the binary itself, which is on disk that you can look at in IDA, it's pretty obvious that something crazy is happening, right? Because you can see a whole bunch of syscall instructions. So, I mean, if you're lucky enough that you find somebody who's doing this sort of more advanced API calling, but they're dumb enough to leave it in their binary that you can analyze, or let's say you dump out some shellcode and you see this, you definitely want to pay close attention to what's happening here because it means probably your breakpoints aren't going to work in X6040 bug, and probably they're doing some extra some extra advanced stuff here that you want to pay attention to. So it's a good tip. If you ever see this in IDA, pay close attention to the functions that have the syscall instructions in them.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's worth noting that this, obviously we're just doing a search here. It's nothing too crazy, but it's only going to work if the syscall instruction is in the binary. So obviously, if they're using APIs and so on, you have your usual techniques, but there are slightly more advanced techniques where we can not have the syscall instruction be in the current code of this binary. It can be elsewhere. So you might not seeing it isn't proof that it's not being used. Seeing it is an immediate red flag. Similarly, if we actually go to these, this specific implementation where we call this function and have a hash, this is specifically syswhispers 2. Now, this is a really popular project. You will see it a lot, at least in red team tooling, because it does all the heavy lifting. It makes it easier, it makes it reliable. So it's definitely something to be knowledgeable of as an analyst, as a reverse engineer, but it's by no means the only way. This could just be, again, a hard-coded or a custom resolution of the number using whatever technique you want. There's several. But this is just kind of, this is the low-hanging fruit for this more sophisticated technique, shall we say? So it's the one to learn about first in this instance.
Let's show them what it looks like in the debugger.
Yeah. So we actually, because we have all these system calls here, and there's quite a lot here, because when we did this, we just kind of exported all the functions. But we now have these offsets. These are all obviously syscall instructions, and we have all the offsets here into the binary. So we can use this to set breakpoints in our debugger. If anyone actually knows a way to do this programmatically easily, like I don't know, I did this manually, and it was a real pain in the arse. But
I asked Mr. X6040 bug, and he said no. He said you have to just set breakpoints. He said they're all static, so you can't. He said to trace it just like us. Anyway, we'll talk about this in a minute. But
sure. So the point is, anyway, if you hopefully in your sample you have a lot less, because really we only need 4 or 5 in our shell code. We just need the open process, the allocate memory, protect memory, write memory, and create thread. So hopefully you have less, and it's a lot easier to do. But we can see here that the offset from the base address is 156D. So we could in here set breakpoints on all of these. So because in a real Blue Peter moment, we've already done this. I'm going to pull this out here, and we're going to take particular note of this one here at offset 1B60. So here, so we can apply this. We can use this to set our breakpoints. So now I'm going to relaunch this syscall's example, but I'm going to run to user code, copy that address. I'm going to change that to 1B60, which I think was right, 1B60. So here I'm just changing the offset. We can see because this is the entry point. This is the address, and I know that it's the last 4 bytes. So I just need to change.
If you guys are
so I'm just changing that.
If you guys are wondering what the heck Rob is doing, it's because Rob won't rebase. So normally we rebase our PE files in IDA so that they have the same base address that they're mapped in memory. But Rob is like, no way. I'm just going to copy the lowest 4 bytes because it's probably going to work out, which of course it does, unless the binary is bigger than the last 4 bytes. But yeah, anyway, I just think it's funny that he does this.
Remind me where the rebasing is.
Under segments.
Segments. There we go. Somewhere down here.
Rebase program.
Thank you.
This is the first time I've ever seen Rob do this.
Well, rebase. Cool. So we could just select this address now. This is great. I should do this more often.
It's so easy.
and set a breakpoint. So breakpoint already set. And you could do this for all the others as well, but and set all your breakpoints. And then when we hit play, nothing happens.
Nothing happens. Yes, demo.
Yeah. Did I forget to sacrifice something to the demo gods?
Let's take a look at those breakpoints again. Is that the right break? Is that the right Syscall?
I'm just going to toggle it. Hang on.
Oh yeah, rebase IDA to 0, just while Rob figures that out. That's also a really nice trick, so that your offsets in IDA are actually just the actual offset in memory from the base address. That's also a nice trick. All right, what are we doing here? Are you just making sure it's the right Syscall?
Yeah, it's in the right one. It's just not breaking.
Let's see it in the. This isn't live. It's definitely live. Let's just take a look at that address. I don't have command, by the way. I can't use the mouse, unfortunately. Yeah, okay. I mean, that looks good to me. You guys see anything weird here? Yeah, let's set a couple breakpoints. See if that works.
Can't tell if you're mocking me or not. So I swear this usually works.
Yeah, now we've created something that evades all detection forever.
Yeah, I need to pay attention.
Yeah, I'm kind of stumped as to why it won't break. Where's Mr. X64 debug when you need him? Well, I mean, we can see it's set though, right?
Okay, so we hit main.
All right. All of this is just to show you how X64 debug has nice indices for syscalls, so you can see what the syscall is. But I still want to show you guys, hopefully.
So we definitely have breakpoint set. What?
Oh, do you have the right PID passed to on the command line?
That's probably it. Good job.
And also, I think isn't there another one running as well in the background? It looks like there's like another pop-up. There's another.
But that's it. It doesn't. But if it can't get a handle to PID, it just quits. So that's obviously why it's quitting. He says.
Well, so like if you look in I think there's already one open. If you go over and you can see there's like a message box open. Is that right? No, that won't have any effect on it. All right, let's step through it. I like stepping through it.
Yeah. Cool. Entry point. Main.
Making fun of me in the chat. All right, we have all the junk windows set up.
Yeah. Where's?
Well, now that you've rebased IDA, you should be able to find the entry point for the actual thing easily. Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Cool. So we got here.
Cool. Actually, this is better. I'm glad it didn't work, so we can actually go through and debug it like real. I hate these canned demos when they just work and people are like, oh yeah, it's so easy if I do it. This is more realistic. If you guys try and do it, this is going to happen to you. Rob's so serious. IDA Pro can sense if you've paid or not. Well, I don't know, but I think North Korea might be able to sense whether you've paid for IDA or not. You guys see that backdoored version of IDA? Beware of pirated software. All right, so did you just restart
3940.
Notepad?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was being janky. So entry point, main. So if we just scroll down to where our process is somewhere. There's our alloc here. So somewhere. Cool. So this is this is the one that the breakpoint we should be hitting. So if we come in, we can see our breakpoint on the syscall.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah. So we had the right address.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure why it wasn't breaking. But the point is, we located the right address and we set the right breakpoint. And we can actually see that when we get to the syscall and we hit our break, x64 debug helpfully looks at the syscall number and populates that for us. So regardless of what function we're in, where we are in the code, what we're doing, it knows that the actual syscall being invoked is anti-allocate virtual memory. And this is kind of the key point we're looking at here for dynamic debugging, is you can find the offsets in IDA. You can set your breakpoints in x64, and then from here, either look at the racks and go and identify that manually by looking it up in NTDLL or in a lookup table, or just debugging it and noting here anti-allocate virtual memory is what's being used.
Yeah, so before we call that, why don't we take a look at the arguments for anti-allocate virtual memory and just show them how to basically debug this if it's a syscall. So also just for those of you, I can see in the chat some people kind of like zoned out while we were doing that. So basically, for some reason, the breakpoint wasn't hit. I'm not sure why, but what we want to show you is if you break on a syscall, first of all, x64 debug will look up the syscall value and it'll populate it with the actual API call that's associated with it. So that was number one. And number two is if you actually have to debug these, obviously you need to figure out what the arguments are for those for these API calls. And you're going to need to look at basically for each syscall, you're going to need to look at what those arguments are and figure out, how they match up with the registers here. So we just want to show you that as well. This is super helpful if you have to debug these things. We should mention at some point we might do another stream where we use WinDebug and we talk about like a sort of a faster, easier way to do this with the kernel debugger. But for right now, like just for this stream, we just want to keep it very simple with like simple examples because this stuff gets like really complicated really fast. So.
Yeah, I know exactly. So if we can see from x64 debug or again the Rex register that it's anti-allocate virtual memory, and we can just Google what it looks like for that. For this particular call, even though it's an internal function, it is documented by Microsoft. But for others, sometimes you'll end up with other websites like pinvoke or .com or similar. But you'll always be able to find what that looks like in terms of what the args are. So here we can see that it takes a handle to the process and it takes a pointer to a location that's going to receive the base address. So it's an out arg. So this is the pointer to a location that once the memory's been allocated, it will be populated with this base address. and then some other stuff like the region size and so on. So this is the one as analysts that we're going to be really interested in, because this will eventually receive the shell code, and then we'll be able to dump it or similar if that's something that we're looking to do.
Do you want to explain
So kind of,
again about like 64-bit calling conventions and how the arguments are passed in registers? So that's also important here.
yeah, no, exactly. So as I talked about earlier, the first 4 integer arguments, so that includes pointers, are passed in RCX, RDX, R8, and R9. So these are highlighted kind of green here by x64 debug. So we have first arg, second arg, third arg, fourth.
Forg.
So the second arg, which is that again that pointer to the base address, it's in RDX. So we can right click this, we can go follow and dump, and we can see it's zeroed out at the moment, which is fine. And then after, if we step over the syscall, RDX gets mangled by what goes on when it transitions over. But we can see here, this has been changed. This is normally actually just a hex. Which one is it? This one?
Yeah.
Looks like this. But you can actually make this life a little bit easier by showing it as a hex long, a 64-bit. This is obviously because it's 64-bit debugger. Thanks to Sergey for this yesterday, by the way. Yeah, I did not know this trick, and it makes it a lot easier.
Thanks to Mr. X64 Debug, who told me this the week before. So making me look good, like I know what I'm doing in a debugger.
Well, I look great now, so it's well, it makes up for a few seconds ago when we couldn't hit
No
a breakpoint for some
breakpoint.
reason. Yeah, syscalls are just that good. You can't actually break on them. That's not true.
Yeah, don't.
So we have this address now. Obviously, we're allocating this memory in the target process, so we can't right click follow and dump here, or if we do, it's not going to work because this is in Notepad. But we can, again, using like Process Hacker or similar, go and have a look in Notepad. Go to memory tab, and it's 5C267. So
Isn't that? Oh, you already called this Syscall?
Is this the right? No, it's the old Notepad, I think. Yeah, let's have a look.
I mean, that looks like it's an address in our process space, not in theirs.
3940. It's because it's a different Notepad? Or it's 3940? It is. I get my own process, so it is in our process, so it would work. But yeah, but it should be in the remote PID. If you don't give yourself your own PID, then it'll inject it in the right place. But if I see 267E00, sets this one here, so we can see it's currently zeroed out because it's only just been allocated. But if we continue running, and then well, in that case it dies because again it was in our own process. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys can follow. I don't know how well you guys are following in the chat. You can let us know. But basically, Rob has decided to make this extremely difficult on himself by injecting the shellcode into his own process instead of in a notepad. So we're going to try it again with Notepad, just so that we can show you guys.
Cool. So we actually hit the syscall this time, just by running the debugger. So that counting that as a win.
Yeah.
So we're going to follow RDX in the dump. Again, it's zeroed. We're going to step over that, and it gets populated with A32. And then we're going to go and have a look at Notepad this time. Let's refresh that. A32 F18. So that's here.
There we go.
Zeroed. And now if we play, obviously if you set all the other syscall breakpoints by taking those offsets, then you'll hit the other calls as well. But now if we reread this, we can actually see our shellcode. Hooray! Including the syscalls thing. And if we look at it, we've got our pop-up.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's kind of nice that this all just went to shit quickly, because this is like a totally easy, straightforward example that we have the source code for that Rob literally wrote. and it was this friggin' ridiculous to get it to work. So this stuff is an extreme pain in the ass if it's like actually, unknown malware. And if you don't have the binary, like I said, a lot of times the actual code that has the syscalls will be hidden from you, so you don't really have it. You have to like dump it out of memory, mark it up in IDA. It gets a lot harder than this, but like so this is a very I don't know, a very controlled example just to give you guys the basics. So at least now you have the basics for knowing you can break on a syscall to see what it is in the debugger. Once you know what it is, you can figure out what the arguments are that are passed to the API that the syscall is associated with. So you can start debugging that way. But and also I'd say probably it's a good idea to try this out yourself with the examples. I'll link them in the video description below after the stream. So it's a good idea to try it out yourself because even in a controlled environment like this, it's a pain. So it just kind of gives you an idea of what you're in for if you find this in malware or one of these tools that Rob has written.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know that this was a little more difficult than it needed to be, but we have the idea is we have a blog post, we have the source code, and now we have the video as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully you guys can kind of really get to grips with it. If you need to, you can follow through. You can read the blog, which actually has working examples, and go over this to actually see it in action. So that's kind of it for now. By far and away, the most effective way of debugging syscalls, I've already said, is with a kernel mode driver or kernel debugger. But that is a whole other thing that would potentially cover another time. These are just a couple of quick wins. Firstly, to introduce syscalls to anyone who's not already familiar with them, really explain what they are and what they look like. And then show some quick wins for finding them. So if your binary has a syscall instructions in it, which doesn't have to be the case for malware, but that's an immediate red flag. And if they do, you can use that to find the calls, rebase it, and set your breakpoints, and debug it to find out exactly what it's doing and where, and find those allocations and extract your second stage payloads and so on.
Right. And I guess there's also, so not for this stream, but we'll probably do something maybe informal on Twitch, OALabs live on Twitch, or maybe another stream like this on YouTube where we do some tracing and show you guys how to, how you might do this if it's a more complex example. I think also we're going to stick around for a few questions and stuff. I know there's a lot of questions you guys had as we were talking, trying to go through the debugging. But before we get to that, I want to mention that there's another way that is more common in malware that we see syscalls used, but they're not actually, so Rob alluded to this earlier, but they're not actually writing the syscall instruction in the malware. And what they do is they will map their own version of anti-DLL into their process space. So they're not using the load module or the Windows loader to load that DLL. What they'll do is they'll actually just read the code in to memory, mark it as executable from ntdll.dll off the disk, and then they'll call directly into the syscalls for that mapped DLL. We see this, I think, I might be wrong, but I think Kpot Stealer, is one of the pieces of malware that does this, where they map NTDLL into memory. And this is a way to basically get access to those syscalls without actually writing the code yourself. There's some other tricky stuff that we won't go into on the stream, but that's like something that you might see more common in malware. Rather than them actually writing the syscall instructions themselves, you'll see them mapping NTDLL a second time into their process space and calling directly into it. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Rob.
No, just I guess if just in case there are any EDR vendors tuning in, one of the best detections for an automatic detection is a syscall instruction being executed that isn't from the standard mapped NTDLL space. So or the other expected locations. Yeah. So if you have NTD from a syscall instruction from some place that's been virtual alloced or from a text section of a random binary, that is a red flag that you can alert on. Obviously, it's not something we're going to do as an analyst. Definitely a consideration. You still get around that as an attacker by just jumping to NTDLL, but it's it's always a cat and mouse game. We can get better at both sides.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll open up to some questions. You're good to stick around for a bit, Rob, and answer questions. Can you see the chat,
For
Rob,
sure.
or do you need me to read them out to you?
I can. It's all the way over here.
Okay,
But
all right. Well, I'll let you pick up whatever you want there. So there's a bunch of questions. Just grab ones you think might be interesting. And
sure. Similarly, if anyone, if we need to kind of show anything again, just let us know.
right. Are you waiting for good questions, Rob?
Tumbleweed.
Yeah. All right. Well, I do see
Potentially.
one question about doesn't Windows change syscall mappings every version? Yes, I feel like maybe we missed, or maybe you missed that part of the stream, but basically there's this tool called Syswhispers 2 that Rob is using, which takes care of that for you. So I believe it like dynamically looks at the syscalls. I don't know, maybe if you want to explain a bit more about how that works, Rob.
Yeah, it creates a look. I think it dynamically creates a lookup table. So I believe it does it each time, and it will find the right versions. Doesn't need to be updated. But the idea is that essentially it does the heavy lifting for you with regards to specific numbers for specific versions, and you just don't have to worry about it as the developer using the syscalls. It's a public repository on GitHub though, Syswhispers 2. It's definitely one to get familiar with if you're looking to use or reverse engineer syscalls. Can you briefly describe the relation between create remote thread, NT create thread X, and ZW create thread, and RTO create user thread, and where the syscall occurs? Sure. So create remote thread is the Windows API version for creating a thread in a remote process. So this is the one that you're expected to use. It's that top level one that's well documented. NT create thread X and ZW create thread in userland are functionally essentially the same. They just have slightly different implementations in kernel mode. Essentially, ZW create thread does a few extra checks. I think it's that way around, with regards to kind of sanitizing parameters and making sure things are okay. Whereas NT create thread X are is just kind of expects those to be correct and will just hand it off. So one's supposed to be used internally, and one's supposed to be used more by like drivers and similar, where they want to do a bit of extra parameter checking. RTL create user thread, I'm not actually sure about the specific differences. You can essentially just do the same thing. You can create a thread in a process again. I'm not sure exactly what the nuances are between the differences between that and create remote thread, but I think it's an internal call that isn't supposed to be used. It's not one that's heavily documented by the API. Question: why x64 debug over IDA debug? I think that's more for Sergey's sake. He's obviously he's an x64 aficionado. It's definitely one of the best out there.
Not true. I'm terrible at x64 debug.
But it's user friendly and it's popular and it's well known. So
yeah,
it's just nice and easy, really. And not everyone has had a pro, unless you want to feed the Koreans. So just using a tool that's open source and free for everyone makes it nice and easy for a stream if you're looking to follow along.
Yeah, I should mention we do use IDA debug in some of our old tutorials because it's a nice way if you're learning how things work. It's a nice way to see your what you're marking up in IDA and the debugger side by side. It's nice to make that connection. But if you're trying to debug malware that's like trying to detect your debugger and stuff, there is like a Silahide plugin for IDA, but the support for x64 debug is just way better. It's just a much better, cleaner debugger. It's a single purpose tool, so it's easier to use. And no dark theme, no light theme only. Anybody over 30, light theme only. If you grew up in the 90s with Retina burning white screens, love the white screen.
I'm dark theme. I'm
Under
at home
30.
PC. Don't worry about that. I'm up 30. Believe it or not.
A zoomer.
Baby face.
Yeah, exactly.
So just as a presenter is saying, one thing that's worth noting about these using the internal like NT functions is that there's a lot of internal structs and internal sort of types that kind of you need to use that perhaps you're not used to using. These get exported by syswhispers really handily. That you're going to in this header file where it gives you everything you need to know and use. And some are just if I mean, struct when you pass around a struct, really, you're just passing around a pointer. So sometimes you can just if it's not necessary, you don't need it. But it's definitely still makes it pretty easy for you, but it's perhaps not the ones that you're familiar with if you've just been familiar with the Windows API.
Any more questions? I see somebody asking if the recording will be available. Yes, it'll be on the same link that you're watching it on now after the stream. Let us know. Any more questions? We'll stick around for another minute or two. If you have any burning questions for me or Rob, get them in the chat and we'll answer them.
Can you provide one example of a method to circumvent the detection you described, syscall from allocated memory? Well, you could just jump to a syscall instruction in NTDLL. It's like it's all in your processes space, right? So just hop over there and then set up all the registers and so on. Just jump to NTDLL.
Yeah, exactly. Just jump straight to the syscall. Somebody's already answering these questions in the chat here. Lots of questions in the chat for guided hacking, which is not us. Very interesting. Almost like they want you to come on stream, Mr. Guided Hacking. Do a video on agentless NSX-based EDRs? No. No videos on EDRs or AGs ever. What else? Transition hook from X32 and instrumentation callbacks for X64. Not sure. Guided hacking doesn't want to come on stream. If enough people ask him, maybe he'll come on stream. No, don't actually bug him. Sorry. Hopefully there's not enough people left on stream to actually be a problem, but don't. No targeted harassing. Any other questions, or we're gonna end the stream? Get them in quickly. Yeah, everyone loves guided hacking. Well, it's been an honor to have him in the chat at least. Okay, I think that's it. I don't see any more questions about this specifically. Some other questions not related to this, but that's it. So I think we're gonna end our stream there. Thanks, Rob, and thanks to our sponsors, which is you guys over at Patreon/OALabs. Give us some money for beer. Let my bulldog eat. Feed my bulldog. Keep these tutorials free. Keep these streams alive. Go sub on Patreon. Anything you want to shout out before we close out, Rob?
No, not for me. No, thanks.
Someone's asking if you stream.
I guess
do you have a Twitch account?
I don't at present. No. I have a blog, which I guess Sergey, you'll put in the description for the walkthrough, but otherwise no content.
Right. One last plug before we go.
UNPACME, a malware unpacking service from Open Analysis. Expose the malware before it exposes you.
All right, guys, you asked for it. We gave it to you. See you later.
Cheers, guys.